Masechet Ketubot Daf Mem Aleph. With this daf, we plan to complete the third perek. The Mishnah is all about the difference between damages and a fine, compensation for the value of something as opposed to a fine. So it gives a few examples. Haomer pititi et bito shel peloni meshalem boshet upagam al pi asmo ve'en meshalem kenas. The main difference is that regarding compensation, if someone admits that he owes compensation, he does pay. If someone admits that he owes a fine, he does not have to pay, because a fine is as a punishment, is punitive for having done that. But if he admits it, then he doesn't have to pay. Whereas compensation, he owes because the item he stole or the damage that he did. But there are some cases that are kind of in between and hard to figure out what they are. So the first example is a man comes and says, I seduced the daughter of that person. So he's admitting it on his own. So therefore he does have to pay the damages, which is the humiliation and the degradation based on his own testimony. But he does not have to pay the fine because he admitted himself. Second case, someone admits that he stole something, so he certainly has to return the original amount of the item that he stole. That is simply the compensation, but he does not have to pay the double for most cases or the 4 and 5 for stealing a sheep or an ox, because that is an added penalty. That's a fine, but he admitted it, so he doesn't have to pay. Hemit shori et peloni or shoro shel peloni. Hareze mishalem al pi atzmo. If someone comes and admits that my ox gored a person or gored the ox of a person, so he has to pay damages. He has to pay he has to pay based on his admission. Hemit shori abdo shel ploni. So the case that we just talked about, the Gemara is going to cite and ask what it's talking about. Is it a shor mu'ad? If it's shor mu'ad, for sure the payment is going to be damages. If it's a shor tam where he pays half, so what is that? Half payment. Would that be consider damages or a fine? That will be most of the discussion of the Gemara. We will attempt to prove it from this line. We'll end up saying, no, this line might just be mu'ad. Okay. Hemit shori abdo shel peloni en meshalem al pi asmo. If someone comes and admits, my ox killed a slave of that person, then he does not pay anything based on his testimony. That's because the payment for a slave, as we saw yesterday, is 30 shekel. No matter what the value of the slave is. Doesn't matter if it's an old and sick slave or a young and strong slave that does skilled work. No, it doesn't matter. It's a set amount. Since it's a set amount, you see that shows it's a fine. If it was damages, then it would depend on the value of the damage. So therefore, he does have to pay. The general rule governing all of these is that anytime the payment is more than the damage, then he does not pay based on his own admission. If the payment is more than the damage, it shows that it's a fine, not damages. And that would be the case in, for example, many cases of a slave. The 30 shekel is a significant sum. It's possible that you have a very skilled slave that's worth more, but most of the time it would be worth less. So the fact that you have to pay that amount shows that it's a fine, and therefore he does not have to pay if he admits it. And Gemara will discuss, well, what about less? Because chatzi nezek, paying half the amount for a short tam, an unwarranted ox, since is less, is that included in this principle or not included in this principle? That will be part of the main discussion. Okay, so now while you gave many examples, but doesn't give all examples, velitni anasti. How come it doesn't say if someone says comes and admits I raped this person? How come over there also we don't say he'll have to pay for the damages, the boshet, the pagam, sa'ar, but would not have to pay the fine? So we answer, Lami baya ka'amad. Yeah, we're saying it's not necessary to teach that. Lami baya anasti. I'm not even going to mention the case of anasti because it's obvious that the fine would not be paid. Delo kapagim la. Because in that case, his accusation is not tarnishing the victim's reputation. Demishalem bo shetupagam al pi asmo. And so in that case, for sure, he would have to pay the degradation and the humiliation to the person he raped. That's yes. As opposed to aval pititi de kapagim la. But if a person admits, I seduced this na'ara, and that means that the na'ara agreed to it. And so in that case, by me making that accusation against some young girl, that would imply that there is something wrong, that she also was complicit, even though she's a minor and all that. But nevertheless, it doesn't look nice for her and for her family, and so for her to so for me to admit it and therefore have to pay is implicating someone else in the crime or in the shame of the crime. And so therefore you might have thought, maybe I don't have that. Maybe the court says, well, we're not gonna believe you to admit something where there's an accomplice. Or where at least it'll bring shame to someone else. Maybe they don't want that, and they're not going to agree to receive the fine. So therefore I would not have to pay it. That's why the Mishnah mentions this case of the seducer, because the case of the rapist is obvious. In case of the rapist, if the man raped that person, then she did nothing wrong. She was totally forced, and so there's no public shame to the family or to her. She didn't agree to do anything that was out of order. Okay, matnitin deloki haitana. Now that we've established why that the case of rape would in fact be the same, we're going to explain that the Mishnah does not follow the following Tana. The Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Af boshet upagam eno mishalem al pi asmo, lo kol amenu sheifgom bito shel peloni. What we just said is not agreed upon by all, because Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon that in the case of seduction, even when the man comes and admits, he does not have to pay for the humiliation and degradation based on his own admission, because why it should not be within his power to tarnish the reputation of someone else's daughter. Therefore, he'll come and admit it, but the other family can just deny it and say, no, our daughter did not agree to your seduction, go away. And so keep your money, and therefore he would not have to pay. So, but our Mishnah is not that opinion. Our Mishnah says he does. The seducer does have to pay. So now Rav Papa asks Abaye, according to the Rabbi Shimon, who says that the seducer does not have to pay because it looks bad for her. Well, what if she does want to? She wants to get the payment of the humiliation and degradation, and even though that could make it public and people will know that she agreed to the seduction, but nevertheless she did feel that humiliation, degradation, and she wants to get paid. So then what? Would you say also that the seducer doesn't have to pay if she's okay and she admits, she agrees, and she wants the payment? So we answer that even if the Na'ara agrees, maybe the father will not agree to receive the payment because he doesn't want the degradation of the name of his family. Okay, what if the father agrees also? The father says, he's upset that his daughter agreed to this, but nevertheless, he wants this money to be paid because this guy did perpetrate a crime, and there is the victim deserves payment. So what if it's okay and the father wants it? No, maybe there's another family member, right? A brother, a cousin, an uncle who says, no, if by you receiving this payment, you're agreeing that our cousin, niece, gave in to this solicitor, and therefore it brings a bad name upon our family name, and so we don't want you to. So, okay, fine. So what if they have a family meeting, and the family meeting they say, you know what, we're going to accept the payment, and that even though that's an admission that this Na'ada did agree to the seduction. What if the whole family agrees? We say, no, it's impossible. There's not one person who was not at the family meeting. They're away in another country. There's some cousin, someone who's part of the family, and therefore who would not agree to this. After all, that family member probably is not getting any monetary benefit from the payment, but they will be known as, oh, we heard about that case. You're the one who has a cousin who agreed to seduction, and that will bring a bad name, and the person will not agree. So therefore, the Bishimon actually says across the board, even if the family, all the father, the people that are around, the family members, all agree that yes, that this was done, and we want the payment, even though that implicates our Na'ara relative. Nevertheless, the seducer does not pay because there may be one family member somewhere who would rather not get the payment and keep their name out of the papers. Okay, ha'omer ganavti mishalem et hakeden. Someone says, I stole, so has to pay the principal of what he stole, but not the double 4 or 5 times. Itmar palga niska rav papa and so on. So the Mishnah, we're continuing with the rest of the Mishnah, including the statement that says for damages, if my ox get damaged your ox, so I do have to pay. That's what the Mishnah said. So now we're going to ask, Itmar, Palganiska, what if it's a shortam? Shortam is an ox that had not gored before. Usually, oxen do not go and gore people and gore other oxen. So if it's a shortam that is not gored before, and it does, it's kind of surprising, he pays, the perpetrator pays half. The owner of the ox pays half. Now, this payment of half, what is its status? That's considered compensation. It is damage. Why half? We'll see in a second. Rav Huna, however, the son of Rav Yoshua says, no, the half payment is a fine. If it was damaged, and you have to pay the whole thing. Why would it be only half? It means it's a fine. So let's explain the reasoning of each one. Reasons that the reason why the perpetrator pays half is because normally oxen are not safe, right? They're not considered watched, and they are safe. And so really, all oxen need to be watched, and it's the responsibility of the owner in case they do something. And therefore, from the letter of the law, from the point of view of strict morality, the owner should pay full amount for his ox, even if it has no history. Oxen sometimes do that. However, but Rachamana, Hashem, the merciful one in the Torah, is compassionate on him because his ox was not forewarned. It never happened before, and this is like, the car insurance companies that give you one free accident before they raise your rates, right? Because it never happened before, so we want to be compassionate and not hit you so hard. So the Torah says, okay, fine, you can only pay half. But really, you should pay the whole thing. So that's the reason why this is compensation. For a technical reason, we want to be compassionate. You don't pay the whole thing, but really you should have to pay the whole thing. So even the half payment is a payment of damages. Now, Rav Huna, Bered Rav Yoshua Amar, Palga Niska Kenasa. He said, Rav Huna, on the other hand, says, no, the whole thing is a fine. Really, he shouldn't have to pay anything at all. Because he thinks that standard oxen are safe. It's like they're watched. Oxen don't go and just gore things for no reason. And so therefore there's no reason to expect that the oxen would have done this, and so therefore he really doesn't have to be. And from the letter of the law, from strict morality, the owner of the perpetrator would not have to pay anything at all. But the Torah comes and says, you know what, but we want to give you a fine so that you'll guard your ox, so that people will guard their oxen, even though it's unusual and you really don't have to. Nevertheless, we want to make a fine so that even those unusual cases will be prevented because of the fine. Okay, since in the letter of the law there is no damages, no compensation necessary, therefore we see that the half payment is not for damages. So what is it? It's a fine. Okay, so now we understand the logic behind both opinions. Now let's see some proofs, and we're now going to see 4 proofs for the side that says that in fact half payment is compensation. So that's the side we're going to say is correct. That's the Rav Papa's opinion, that it is compensation. And these are challenges to Rav Huna, who says that it's a penalty. Okay, there's a mnemonic device to remember the following 4 proofs are Hezek, Ma, Vehemit, Kelal. Okay, the first one, Hezek, is going to quote a Mishnah, and Baba Kama says, Tenan, Hanizak v'hamazik betashlumin. It says, in the case of ox goring someone else, and it's a short tam, both the victim and the damager share in the payment. That's what it says. Basically, that the one doing the damage pays half, and the victim, he has to share, and he kind of pays himself the other half. He doesn't get it from the one who did the damage. So let's analyze. According to the one who says that the half amount that's paid is in fact compensation for damage, that's why it makes sense to talk about he who is damaged really deserves the whole thing. But in this case, because it's a short time, so the victim himself is responsible for half of the damage. He has to pay out of his own pocket. So the language here makes sense in terms of mazik, nizak, and they're both paying towards the full amount because the full amount is all damage. But according to the one who says that the half amount is only a fine, so the owner is taking half of the damage that is actually not his. We're not talking about damage. The payment of the perpetrator is not payment for damage, but rather a fine. So that's it. He just pays a fine, which happens to be half the amount. But there's no payment of damages, so it does not make sense to use the language that the victim pays for half the damage. Nobody pays for any of the damage. It was just an accident. There's no damage payment. And so you wouldn't say that they share in the damage payment. And so therefore this Mishnah proves that it is the all damage payment is correct. Rav Papa is correct, and Rav Huna is difficult to say it's a fine. So we answer lo nisrecha ela lifchat nevela. Oh no! When the Mishnah said that the victim shares in the loss of the damage, we're not talking about the half payment that he pays out of his pocket, but rather a different loss. That it's the loss of the degradation of the carcass. The way that we calculate the damage is we take the ox that was gored and killed. So what was its value just before it was gored? Let's say it was $1,000. And what is its value right after it was gored? Now it's a carcass, but the carcass is still worth money. You can't. It's not kosher meat, but you can use the skin. You can you can give the non-kosher meat to non-Jews, sell it, and so it is still worth money. So let's say it's only worth $200. Okay, so the difference is $800, and then so that means that the perpetrator will have to pay half of $800. Will pay $400. Okay, now the $200 of the carcass, that belongs to the owner, its original owner. He keeps it. However, it may take some time. By the time he gets to the scene and goes to court and figures out what to do, it could be that the value of the carcass will go down. The meat won't be fresh. And now, by the time he gets around to being able to sell it, it'll only be worth 100. So now he, in fact, lost 100 of what was coming to him. Not only does he lose the 400 of the half damages, but he might lose another 100 for the degradation of the carcass. And that's what we're talking about, that he shares in the payment, shares in the loss. We're talking about that loss. So in fact, we could say that the other 400 is a fine, and the sharing is not the other 400, because that's not sharing. He's not sharing the fine, and there's not damages here, but rather we're talking about the loss from the carcass. Okay, now, Pechad Nebela Tanena. Hold on, that can't be that this Mishnah is referring to the loss because of degradation of the carcass, because we have another Mishnah that already taught that. Tanena Tashlome Nezek Melamed Shaba'alim Metapelin Ba Nebela is actually a Baraita, but the Baraita is commenting on a Mishnah that's earlier than the Mishnah that we just said. And that Mishnah says, Tashlome Nezek, whenever someone is paying for damage, he has to pay with the best of his land. And this Baraita is coming and saying, when it says that he has to pay, that teaches that the Be'alim, that the owner of the ox, meaning the ox that was gored, the victim, has to deal with the nevela. He bears the cost. And if it degrades, he bears the cost of the degradation. So we learn already from, there was a Baraita that learned from a phrase of the Mishnah that the degradation is paid for, is the responsibility of the owner, of the victim. So we know that already. This Mishnah, which comes after that Mishnah, wouldn't have to teach it. And so we answer, no, chada betam v'chada b'mu'ad. We actually do need both of these mishnayot to teach that the degradation is the responsibility of the owner. To teach, one is talking about shor tam, one is talking about shor mu'ad. And you couldn't necessarily infer one from the other, because usricha diashminan tam mishum de'akate la iya'ad ava mu'ad di'iya'ad emala. If you only told me about the shor tam, so there, it's because the perpetrator was not forewarned. So that's why he's not so responsible. And so I don't know anything about your degradation of the carcass, or the perpetrator would say, I don't have to pay for that. But if it was a shor mu'ad, where he was forewarned, so then he is fully responsible for the full damage and also for the degradation of the carcass. And so I would say that maybe in that case the owner is not. So you need to tell to me in the shor mu'ad that even there the owner is responsible, not the perpetrator. And if you only told me regarding the shor mu'ad, I would say there the owner is responsible for the payment of the for the loss of the degradation of the carcass, because the perpetrator is paying the entire damage. And so since he's paying the entire damage, all 800, that's a significant amount. The relatively small amount of only 100, so okay, the owner has to take care of that. But regarding Tam, where the perpetrator is only paying 400, then I would say, since he's paying so little, therefore the perpetrator is responsible for the degradation. I might have thought that, so that's why I need both Mishnayot to tell me that both Tam and Mu'ad, the owner is responsible for degradation of his own animal. Okay, now, so all that was the first proof. That didn't work, so we're going to try again. Second one, Tashema, ma ben tam le mu'ad. This one, by the way, is the ma in the mnemonic before. And then we're going to have hemit and kilal. So this Baraita asks a question: what's the difference between damage by a shor tam and damage by a shor mu'ad? She'atam mishalem chasi nezek migufo, u'mu'ad mishalem nezek shalem min ha'aliyah. That when you pay, when a shor tam pays, he pays from its own body, whereas a mu'ad has to pay from the entire amount. Let's explain. If a shor tam let's say the short that did the damaging, short tam, is only worth $500. And it goes and does damage of a really expensive animal that's worth $2,000. So the perpetrator has to pay half of the damage of the 2,000, which is 1,000. However, the law by short tam is that the maximum that the owner of the short tam would have to pay is the value of his own animal that did the damage. It will be like if I have a cheap car and I bang into your expensive car, I shouldn't have to pay any more than the full damage to my cheap car. It's not my fault that you're driving an expensive car. I should only have to pay the maximum damage that I could have gotten if you had hit me. Okay, that's not the law, but there is some logic to that. Okay, and so that's the law Machasi Nezek. Whereas if the short is mu'ad, then I have to pay the entire amount. Even if my ox was worth less than yours, I still have to pay the full amount of your ox. Okay, now you see that it only gives one difference between tam and mu'ad. And it does not make a distinction and say that regarding short tam, if I admit to it, if there was no witnesses, and so I come and admit, then I don't have to pay because it's a fine, whereas mu'ad, I do have to pay because there it's damages. According to Rav Huna, who says it's a fine, that would be an additional difference between these two cases that should have been mentioned. Since it wasn't mentioned, so therefore this is a proof for Rav Papa that in fact this is payment of damages. And that's why there is in fact no difference between admission in tam and mu'ad. Admission he would have to pay in either case because it's damages. So we answer no for Rav Huna, Tana v'Shiyer. Maybe this Braita is not a completely exhaustive list of all differences. It mentioned one difference, but it may be other differences that were not mentioned. All right, fine. But my shiyer, tehai shiyer, there's a principle that if you're going to leave out examples, you have to leave out at least two or more examples. Whenever you put, have a list and say etc. You don't write etc. if there's only one more thing that's not on the list. You only write etc. if you want to save space and there's two or more things that you're leaving out. So you have to show me something else that you would be leaving out that to justify leaving out one thing. So the answer that the other thing could be leaving out is shiyer hatzi kofe. If my ox kills another person, not a slave, a regular person, then technically the ox gets killed, and even the owner of the ox deserves a death penalty. But in that case, since the man didn't commit murder himself, but only his ox did, he can pay a ransom for his life. Fine. That was true and regarding a shor mu'ad. What if it's a shor tam? Does the person pay half of the ransom of his life? He does not. So that would be another difference between shor tam and shor mu'ad that could have been listed. So you see, it is in fact leaving out two cases. So Rav Huna could say, yeah, there is a difference, but it left it out. But then we reject that. No, the leaving out of this case of a half a ransom is not considered an omission that would be significant because this Mishnah could be the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili, because he in fact says that even if in the case of a shor tam who that goes and kills a person, the owner, instead of getting the death penalty, does pay half of the ransom. So there is no distinction between tam and mu'ad regarding chatzi kofir. Therefore, there would be only one additional case omitted from the Mishnah, and we don't omit only one case of the Mishnah. Therefore, this Mishnah is in fact complete and is giving all of the differences. And so the only differences between the tam and mu'ad is the payment of half or all, and the fact that it does not say that there's a difference regarding admission or non-admission. And so there will only be a difference between admission and non-admission if it was a fine. So therefore, this would be proof that is in fact a monetary payment. So the bottom line is that, yes, if we follow the Biosegeli, then this would be a proof for Rav Papa, that it's a monetary payment. However, Rav Huna can always say that the opinion, this Mishnah does not follow Bias Legeli, and there are two items that are left out of it. And so there's actually no proof from this part of the Mishnah either way. Instead, we're going to go to the no proof from that Mishnah. Instead, we're going to go to our third proof, which is from our Mishnah that we started with. Tashema hemit shori et peloni o shoro she peloni hadeze mishalem al pi asmo. Someone comes in and admits that my ox killed this person or killed the ox of that person. He has to pay based on his own testimony. Maila betam is just talking about a short tam, and you see that he has to pay even though he admitted it. That proves that this is damages, like Rav Papa, and not a fine. Because if it was a fine, then he would not have to pay. And so even though this is a short tam and payment is half, nevertheless he does pay. So there you go. This is a proof that his damages and not payment. And then we say, Lo, b'mu'ad. No, how do you know talking about short tam? Maybe it's talking about short mu'ad. And that's what short mu'ad, everyone agrees, is damages. And that's why he has to pay. So we say, well, aval betam mai, and no mishalem al pi atzmo. But if it was short tam, then he wouldn't pay based on his admission. Does that work? Adetani sefa. Abdo shel peloni, and no mishalem al pi asmo. V'niflog v'nitne bedida. The sefa wants to give a contrasting case. And the contrasting case in the next part is that if my ox kills a slave of another person, then I do not pay based on my admission, because slave is 30 shekel, is definitely a fine. So we want to find a distinction between two cases, so it goes to slave. But why are you jumping to a different case altogether of a slave? You could have made a closer contrast. Whenever you make a contrast between cases, you want the cases to be as similar as possible, with just a small difference to show where the borderline is. So why not give the contrasting case in and of itself, of the case not of killing a slave, but rather of killing the someone else's animal? And you could have said, when do you have to pay? And when one admits only if it's a shomuad, but tam and no mishalem al pi asmo. But if it's a tam and I admit, then I don't pay, even in that very case of killing someone's ox or killing the person himself. And so that would have been a better contrast. And our answer is not necessarily kula b'mu'ad kamayre. Maybe the whole Mishnah is all talking about mu'ad, and so that's why we're not to talk about a short time would be going to a completely different case. We want to stick with the theme of mu'ad, and within mu'ad there's a distinction between killing someone's animal and killing his slave. Okay, so therefore that is not a proof, and so finally we will have one good proof, solid proof. Tashema ze'akilal is from the last line of the Mishnah that says the general rule: Kol mishem yater alma shehizik eno mishalem al pi atzmo. Anyone who's paid any time where the payment is more than the value of the damage, so obviously it's not damages, that is a fine, and therefore if I admit it, I don't have to pay. So if we can infer from the language that it only says more, that if I'm paying less than the value of the damage, and chasi nezek is less than the full damage, then that's not a fine, that is a payment, and I would have to pay even if I admit it. Proof for Rav Huna. And then we say, no, not necessarily. La tema ha-pachot mashezik, ela ema ha-kemashehizik mishal al pi asmo. Don't interpret it as, therefore, since the Mishnah said, if you pay more, then it's a fine, but less is not a fine. Maybe not. Maybe it just means if I pay the same amount, then it's damages. And I pay based on admission. But if it's different than the amount of the damage, more or less, it would be considered a fine. So can we read it that way? And the Gemara says no. The words don't say that. Aval pachot mai eno mishalem al pi asmo. So you're saying less. If it's less, then I would not have to pay based on my admission, because less or more is not the same and therefore is a fine. Then the Mishnah should have said, anytime that the payment is not equal to the damage, I don't pay based on my own admission, because that is a fine. Because in that case it would mean more or less. But the Mishnah does not say that. It only gives the example of more, and therefore the language of the Mishnah shows clearly that if the payment is less, then it still is is damages, and therefore Rav Papa is proven correct. That is damages, and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, is proven wrong, that it's a fine. Tiyuvta, that's the final statement. So we have disproven the idea that it's a fine. But then we have something surprising. Halacha l'maaseh, though, is that the half damage is a fine. So now we're wondering, we just went through this whole exercise in four proofs, and each one we found some way to answer, but the last one was conclusive proof, and yet you say the halacha follows that it's a fine. Tiyubta v'hilcheta, you rejected that it's a fine, and nevertheless you say the halacha is that it's a fine? And we say, yeah. What's the only reason that it was disproven is because the Mishnah didn't say the same amount. If the payment is equal to the damages, then we know it's considered damages. You wanted it to say that rather than say more than. Okay, but la pesika le, but that's not necessarily a clear-cut proof. Kevan deika hasin nezik serot elchata kimidila demamonahu mishum hachi lo katane, because there is another case that the Mishnah just didn't want to get into, because it's and the case is that of sidorot, pebbles. If an animal's walking and public domain, and some pebbles just shoot out while it's walking and damages someone, so that is an unusual form of damage, and the owner has to pay only half. But we have a halacha, the tradition, that is considered damages, not a fine. So that's for sure damages. So therefore, the Mishnah was purposeful in its language and said, anytime, in all cases where the payment is more than the damage, like paying for a slave that's 30 shekel when the slave is worth less, then you know that's a fine. And it didn't mention the case at all of the damages being less. It wanted to leave it out because when the damage is less, it depends. In one case, pebbles, we know for sure that the half payment is actually damages. And so it couldn't give a general rule that anytime the payment is less, it's always a fine, because in this case, it's damages. But it was not trying to imply that chasin nezik of a short tam is also damages. No, it just didn't want to talk about it because of the serorot case. But in fact, you can easily read the Mishnah and as agreeing with the opinion of Papa that because it's a different amount than the usual, it's a chasin nezik. It is in fact a fine. Okay, so therefore, even though the end of this discussion did say tiyubta, right? Someone had an answer at some later point, and therefore decided halacha against that tiyubta because they relied on that other answer. All right, now that we've established halacha l'maaseh that the half payment is in fact a fine, well, that's going to have effects on some other cases that are also unusual damage, and other cases of unusual damage is also a fine. And we have a general rule that a fine has to be collected in Eretz Yisrael, only in courts there, where we had judges who had official semicha. Only judges with official semicha that was done in Eretz Yisrael can give a fine. In Bavel, while they did have batei dinim, but they were not experts. They were not of judges with semicha, and so they could judge cases of compensation, but they cannot impose fines. So that would make a difference in other cases where it's a fine. For example, if you have a dog that eats a lamb, it's not usual for a dog to come and strangle a lamb and eat it. If it does, or a cat that eats a big rooster, usually eats a small rooster, not a big one. Mishunehu, that's unusual. And therefore, since it's unusual, what the owner is not expected to guard his animal against that, and therefore has the same law as a short tam. And it's a fine. Since it's a fine, it cannot be collected. The court in Bavel cannot collect it. But if the cat eats small roosters, that's what it usually does. Umagbinan, then that's not a fine, but a compensation, a payment for damages, and the court in Bavel can collect that amount. However, in those cases, if the victim goes and grabs the money from the perpetrator, right? You killed your cat. Killed my big rooster, and even though the court can't do anything about it, if the owner goes and seizes the payment on his own, we do not remove it from him, right? He could take the law into his own hands. Or if the victim says, I want to make an appointment to see you in a bet din in Israel. Usually, you're supposed to remain close to the bet din that is nearby. You can't drag your other litigant far away. But in this case, since the local courts can't do a fine, so the victim has a right to say, I want to make an appointment and you need to come to Eretz Yisrael. Makbinan there, we make such an appointment and he can force the perpetrator to come to Eretz Yisrael. Ve'ila azel meshamtinan there. And then if he doesn't go, so we excommunicate the bet din in Bavel, does have the power to excommunicate the perpetrator if he doesn't go to Eretz Yisrael to have it adjudicated there. And furthermore, ben kach or ben kach, mishametinan the court in Bavel will excommunicate the perpetrator until he removes the damaging animal that is unsafe. Because we can tell him, remove the cause of the damage. This is unsafe. We learn that from Rabbi Natan. Betoch betosh nemar velo tasim damim bebetecha. Rabbi Natan taught, how do you know that you should not have a vicious dog in your house, and you should not have a ladder that's not safe in your house? You're just asking for damage to happen. So don't even have it in the house. Don't wait until an accident happens, until this dog goes and bites someone. It's prohibited to have it. We know that from the pasuk that says that you should make a fence around your roof and do not place blood in your house. Meaning, if you don't make a safe roof and someone falls down, you are responsible. You're not only responsible for actively doing something bad, but for creating a potentially dangerous situation, you have to prevent that. And so this is a good source for the government of Israel mandating seatbelts and airbags and other safety devices so that people don't get hurt is another good example. And so this would also involve owning a dangerous pet would be prohibited. Hazran alach elu na'arot chazakim u'beruchim.